Chapter 9 of the Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming. Chapter 9. Leyline. In one instant Sir Norman was on his feet, and his hand on his sword. In the tarry darkness neither the face nor figure of the intruder could be made out, but he merely saw a darker shadow beside him, standing in the sea of darkness. Perhaps he might have thought it a ghost, but that the hand which grasped his shoulder was unmistakably of flesh and blood and muscle, and the breathing of its owner was distinctly audible by his side. "Who are you?" demanded Sir Norman, drawing out his sword and wrenching himself free from his unseen companion. "Ah, it is you, is it? I thought so," said a not unknown voice. "I have been calling you till I am hoarse, and at last gave it up, and started after you in despair. What are you doing here?" "You, Ormistan!" exclaimed Sir Norman, in the last degree astonished. "How? When? What are you doing here?" "What are you doing here? That's more to the purpose. Down flat on your face, with your head stuck through that hole. What is below there, anyway?" "Never mind," said Sir Norman, hastily, who, for some reason quite unaccountable to himself, did not wish Ormistan to see. "There's nothing there in particular but a lower range of vaults. Do you intend telling me what has brought you here?" "Certainly. The very fleetest horse I could find in the city." "Pshaw! You don't say!" exclaimed Sir Norman, incredulously. "But I presume you had some object in taking such a gallop?" "May I ask what? Your anxious solicitude on my account, very likely." "Not precisely. But I say, Kingsley, what light is that shining through there? I mean to see." "No, you won't," said Sir Norman, rapidly and noiselessly repacing the flag. "It's nothing, I tell you, but a number of will-o'-the-wisps having a ball. Finally, and for the last time, Mr. Ormistan, will you have the goodness to tell me what has sent you here?" "Come out to the air, then. I have no fancy for talking in this place. It smells like a tomb." "There is nothing wrong, I hope?" inquired Sir Norman, following his friend, and threading his way gingerly through the piles of rubbish in the profound darkness. "Nothing wrong, but everything extremely right. Confound this place! It would be easier walking on live eels than through these winding and lumbered passages. Thank the fates! We are through them at last, for there is the daylight, or rather the nightlight, and we have escaped without any bones broken." They had reached the mouldering and crumbling doorway, shown by a square of lighter darkness, and exchanged the damp, chill atmosphere of the vaults for the stagnant, sultry, open air. Sir Norman, with the notion in his head that his dwarfish highness might have placed sentinels around his royal residence, endeavored to pierce the gloom in search of them. Though he could discover none, he still thought discretion the better part of valor, and stepped out into the road. "Now, then, where are you going?" inquired Ormistan, following him. "I don't wish to talk here. There is no telling who may be listening. Come along." Ormistan glanced back at the gloomy rain looming up like a black spectre in the blackness. "Well, they must have a strong fancy for eavesdropping, I must say. Who would go to that haunted heap to listen? What have you seen there? And where have you left your horse?" "I told you before," said Sir Norman, rather impatiently. "I have seen nothing, at least nothing you would care about, and my horse is waiting for me at the Golden Crown." "Very well. We have no time to lose, so get there as fast as you can, and mount him and ride as if the demon were after you back to London." "Back to London? Is this man crazy? I shall do no such thing, let me tell you, to night." "Oh, just as you please," said Ormistan, with a great deal of indifference, considering the urgent nature of his former request. "You can do as you like, you know, and so can I, which translated means, I will go and tell her you have declined to come." "Tell her? Tell whom? What are you talking about? Hang it, man!" exclaimed Sir Norman, getting somewhat excited and profane. "What are you driving at? Can't you speak out, and tell me at once?" "I have told you," said Ormistan, testily, "and I will tell you again. She sent me in search of you, and if you don't choose to come, that's your affair, and not mine." This was a little too much for Sir Norman's overwrought feelings, and In the last degree of exasperation, he laid violent hands on the collar of Ormistan's doublet, and shook him as if he would have shaken the name out of a jerk. "I tell you what it is, Ormistan, you had better not aggravate me. I can stand a good deal, but I'm not exactly Moses or Job, and you had better mind what you're at. If you don't come to the point at once, and tell me who she is, I'll throttle you where you stand, and so give you warning." Half indignant and wholly laughing, Ormistan stepped back out of the way of his excited friend. "I cry you mercy in one word, then. I have been dispatched by a lady in search of you, and that lady is Leoline." It has always been one of the unscrupulous mysteries in natural philosophy that I never could fathom, why men do not faint. Certain it is, I never yet heard of a man swooning from excess of surprise or joy, and perhaps that may account for Sir Norman's not doing so on the present occasion. But he came to an abrupt standstill in their rapid career, and if it had not been quite so excessively dark, his friend would have beheld a countenance wonderful to look on, in its mixture of utter astonishment and sublime consternation. "Leoline!" he faintly gasped. "Just stop a moment, Ormistan, and say that again, will you?" "No," said Ormistan, hurrying unconcernedly on. "I shall do no such thing, for there is no time to lose, and if there were, I have no fancy for standing in this dismal road. Come on, man, and I'll tell you as we go." Thus abjured, and seeing there was no help for it, Sir Norman, in a dazed and bewildered state, complied, and Ormistan promptly and briskly relaxed into business. "You see, my dear fellow, to begin at the beginning, after you left, I stood at ease at La Masque's door, awaiting that lady's return, and was presently rewarded by seeing her come up with an old woman called Prudence. Do you recollect the woman who rushed screaming out of the house of the dead bride?" "Yes, yes." "Well, that was Prudence. She and La Masque were talking so earnestly they did not perceive me, and well, the fact is, Kingsley, I stayed and listened. Not a very handsome thing, perhaps, but I couldn't resist it. They were talking of some one they called Leoline, and I, in a moment, knew that it was your flame, and that neither of them knew any more of her whereabouts than we did." "And yet La Masque told me to come here in search of her," interrupted Sir Norman. "Very true. That was odd, wasn't it? This Prudence, it appears, was Leoline's nurse, and La Masque, too, seemed to have a certain authority over her, and between them, I learned she was to have been married this very night, and died, or at least Prudence thought so, an hour or two before the time." "Then she was not married?" cried Sir Norman, in an ecstasy of delight. "Not a bit of it, and what is more, didn't want to be; and judging from the remarks of Prudence, I should say, of the two, rather preferred the plague." "Then why was she going to do it? You don't mean to say she was forced?" "Ah, but I do, though. Prudence owned it with the most charming candor in the world." "Did you hear the name of the person she was to have married?" asked Sir Norman, with kindling eyes. "I think not. They called him the count, if my memory serves me, and Prudence intimated that he knew nothing of the melancholy fate of Mistress Leoline. Most likely it was the person in the cloak and slouched hat we saw talking to the watchman." Sir Norman said nothing, but he thought a good deal, and the burden of his thoughts was an ardent and heartfelt wish that the Count L'Estrange was once more under the swords of the three robbers, and waiting for him to ride to the rescue. That was all. "La Masque urged Prudence to go back," continued Ormistan, "but Prudence respectfully declined, and went her way, bemoaning the fate of her darling. When she was gone, I stepped up to Madame Masque, and that lady's first words of greeting were an earnest hope that I had been edified and improved by what I had overheard." "She saw you, then?" asked Sir Norman. "See me! I believe you. She has more eyes than ever Argus had, and each one is as sharp as a cambric needle. Of course I apologized, and so on, and she forgave me handsomely, and then we fell into discoursing. Need I tell you on what subject?" "Love, of course," said Sir Norman. "Yes, mingled with entreaties to take off her mask that would have moved a heart of stone. It moved what was better, the heart of Masque and Kingsley. She has consented to do it, and she says that if, after seeing her face, if I still love her, she will be my wife." "Is it possible? My dear Ormistan, I congratulate you with all my heart." "Thank you." After that she left me, and I walked away in such a frenzy of delight that I couldn't have told whether I was treading this earth or the shining stars of the seventh heaven, when suddenly there flew past me a figure all in white, the figure of a bride, Kingsley, pursued by an excited mob. We were both near the river, and the first thing I knew she was plump into it, with the crowd behind yelling to stop her, that she was ill of the plague. Great heaven! And was she drowned? "No, though it was not her fault. The Earl of Rochester and his page, you remember that page, I fancy, were out in their barge, and the Earl picked her up. Then I got a boat, set out after her, claimed her, for I recognized her, of course, brought her ashore, and deposited her safe and sound in her own house. What do you think of that?" "Ormistan," said Norman, catching him by the shoulder with a very excited face, "is this true?" "True as preaching, Kingsley, every word of it. And the most extraordinary part of the business is, that her dip in cold water has effectually cured her of the plague. Not a trace of it remains." Sir Norman dropped his hand and walked on, staring straight before him, perfectly speechless. In fact, no known language in the world could have done justice to his feelings at that precise period, for 3 times that night, in 3 different shapes, had he seen his same Leyline, and at the same moment he was watching her decked out in a royal state in the rain. Ormistan had probably been assisting her from her cold bath in the river Thames. Astonishment and consternation are words altogether too feeble to express his state of mind, but one idea remained clear and bright amid all his mental chaos, and that was, that the Leoline he had fallen in love with dead was awaiting him alive and well in London. "Well," said Ormistan, "you don't speak. What do you think of all this?" "Think! I can't think. I've got past that long ago," replied his friend, hopelessly. "Did you really say Leoline was alive and well?" "And waiting for you. Yes, I did, and I repeat it. And the sooner you get back to town, the sooner you will see her. So don't loiter." "Ormistan, what do you mean? Is it possible I can see her to-night?" "Yes, it is. The dear creature is waiting for you even now. You see, after we got to the house, and she had consented to become a little rational, mutual explanations ensued, by which it appeared she had run away from Sir Norman Kingsley's in a state of frenzy, and jumped into the river in a similarly excited state of mind, and was most anxious to go down on her pretty knees and thank the aforesaid Sir Norman for saving her life. What could any one as gallant as myself do under these circumstances but offer to set forth in quest of that gentleman? And she promptly consented to sit up and wait his coming, and dismissed me with her blessing. And, Kingsley, I've a private notion she is as deeply affected by you as you are by her, for when I mentioned your name she blushed, yea, verily, to the roots of her hair, and when she spoke of you couldn't so much as look at me in the face, which is, you must own, a very bad symptom." "Nonsense!" said Sir Norman, energetically, and had it been daylight, his friend would have seen that he blushed almost as extensively as the lady. "She doesn't know me." "Ah, doesn't she, though? That shows all you know about it. She has seen you go past the window many and many a time, and to see you," said Ormistan, making a grimace under cover of the darkness, "is to love. She has told me so herself." "What! That she loved me?" exclaimed Sir Norman, his notions of propriety to the last degree shocked by such a revelation. "Not altogether. She only looked that; but she said she knew you well by sight, and by heart, too, as I inferred from her countenance when she said it. There now, don't make me talk any more, for I have told you everything I know, and about hoarse with my exertions. One thing only. Did she tell you who she was? No, except that her name was Leoline, and nothing else, which struck me as a bit being slightly improbable. Doubtless she will tell you everything, and one piece of advice I may venture to give you, which is, you may propose as soon as you like without fear of rejection. Here we are at the Golden Crown, so go in and get your horse, and let us be off." All this time Ormistan had been leading his own horse by the bridle, and as Sir Norman silently complied with this suggestion, in 5 minutes more they were in their saddles and galloping at breakneck speed toward the city. To tell the truth, one was not more inclined for silence than the other, and the profoundest and thoughtfulest silence was maintained till they reached it. One was thinking of Leoline, the other of La Masque. Both were badly in love, and just at that particular moment very happy. Of course the happiness of people in that state never lasts longer than half an hour at a stretch, and then they are plunged back again into misery and distraction. But while it does last, in it very intense and delightful indeed. Our two friends, having drained the bittern, had got to the bottom of the cup, and neither knew that no sooner was the sweet swallowed than it was to be replenished with a doubly bitter dose. Neither of them dismounted till they reached the house of Leyline, and there Sir Norman secured his horse, looked up at it with a beating heart. Not that it was very unusual for his heart to beat, seeing it never did anything else, but on that occasion its motion was so much accelerated that any doctor, feeling his pulse, might have justly set him down as a bad case of heart disease. A small bright ray of light streamed like a beacon of hope from an upper window, and the lover looked at it as a clouded mariner might at the shining of the North Star. "Are you coming in, Ormistan?" he inquired, feeling for the first time in his life almost bashful. "It seems to me it would only be right, you know." "I don't mind going in and introducing you," said Ormistan, "but after you have been delivered over, you may fight your own battles and take care of yourself. Come on." The door was unfastened, and Ormistan sprang upstairs with the air of a man quite at home, followed more decorously by Sir Norman. The door of the ladies' room stood ajar, as he had left it, and in answer to his tapping at the chamber door, a sweet feminine voice called, "Come in." Ormistan promptly obeyed, and the next instant they were in the room, and in the presence of the dead bride. Certainly she did not look dead, but very much alive, just then, as she sat in an easy chair drawn up before the dressing table, on which stood the solitary lamp that illumined the chamber. In one hand she held a small mirror, or, as it was then called, a sprunking glass, in which she was contemplating her own beauty, with as much satisfaction as any other pretty girl might justly do. She had changed her drenched dress during Ormistan's absence, and now sat arrayed in a swelling amplitude of rose-colored satin, her hair clasped and bound by a circle of milk-white pearls, and her pale, beautiful face looking 10 degrees more beautiful than ever, in contrast with the bright rose silk, shining dark hair, and rich white jewels. She rose up as they entered, and came forward with the same glow on her face and the same light in her eyes that one of them had seen before, and stood with drooping eyelashes, lovely as a vision, in the centre of the room. "You see I have lost no time in obeying your ladyship's commands," began Ormistan, bowing low. "Mistress Leyline, allow me to present Sir Norman Kingsley." Sir Norman Kingsley bent almost as profoundly before the lady as the Lord High Chancellor had done before Queen Miranda, and the lady curtsied in return until her pink satin skirt ballooned out all over the floor. It was quite an affecting tableau, and so Ormistan felt as he stood eyeing it with preternatural gravity. "I owe my life to Sir Norman Kingsley," murmured the faint, sweet voice of the lady, "and could not rest until I had thanked him. I have no words to say how deeply thankful and grateful I am." "Fairest Leoline, one word from such lips would be enough to repay me, had I done 1,000-fold more," responded Norman, laying his hand on his heart with another deep genuflection. "Very pretty indeed," remarked Ormistan to himself, with a little approving nod. "But I'm afraid they won't be able to keep it up, and go on talking on stilts like that till they have finished. Perhaps they may get on all the better if I take myself off, there being always one too many in a case like this." Then aloud, "Madame, I regret that I am obliged to depart, having a most particular appointment, but doubtless my friend will be able to express himself without my assistance. I have the honor to wish you both good night." With which neat and appropriate speech, Ormistan bowed himself out, and was gone before Leoline could detain him, even if she had wished to do so. Probably, however, she thought the care of one gentleman sufficient responsibility at once, and she did not look very seriously distressed by his departure, and the moment he disappeared, Sir Norman brightened up wonderfully. It is very discomposing to the feelings to make love in the presence of a third party, and Sir Norman had no intention of wasting his time on anything, and went at it immediately. Taking her hand with a grace that would have beaten Sir Charles Grandison or Lord Chesterfield all to nothing, he led her to a couch, took a seat as near her as was at all polite or proper, considering the brief nature of their acquaintance. The curtains were drawn, the lamp shed a faint light, the house was still, and there was no intrusive papa to pounce down upon them. The lady was looking down, and seemed in no way haughty or discouraging, and Sir Norman's spirits went up with a jump to boiling point. Yet the lady, with all her pretty bashfulness, was the first to speak. "I'm afraid, Sir Norman, you must think this a singular hour to come here; but in these dreadful times we cannot tell if we may live from one moment to another, and I should not like to die, or have you die, without my telling, and you hearing all my gratitude. For I do assure you, Sir Norman," said the lady, lifting her dark eyes with the prettiest and most bewitching earnestness, "that I am grateful, though I cannot find words to express it." "Madame, I would not listen to it if you would, for I have done nothing to deserve thanks. I wish I could tell you what I felt when Ormistan told me you were alive and safe." "You are very kind; but pray do not call me madame. Say Leoline." "1,000 thanks, dear Leoline!" exclaimed Sir Norman, raising her hand to his lips, and quite beside him with ecstasy. "Ah, I did not tell you to say that!" she cried, with a gay laugh and a vivid blush. "I never said you were to call me dear." "It arose from my heart to my lips," said Sir Norman, with thrilling earnestness and fervid glance, "for you are dear to me, dearer than all the world beside." The flush grew a deeper glow on the lady's face, but, singular to relate, she did not look the least surprised or displeased, and the hand he had feloniously purloined lay passive and quite contented in his. "Sir Norman Kingsley is pleased to jest," said the lady in a subdued tone, and with her eyes fixed pertinaciously on her shining dress, "for he has never spoken to me before in his life." "That has nothing to do with it, Leoline. I love you as devotedly as if I had known you from your birthday; and, strange to say, I feel as if we had been friends for years, instead of minutes. I cannot realize at all that you are a stranger to me." Leoline laughed. "Nor I; though, for that matter, you are not a stranger to me, Sir Norman." "Am I not? How is that?" "I have seen you go past so often, you know, and Prudence told me who you were, and so I used," hesitating and glowing to a degree before which her dress paled. "Well, dearest," said Sir Norman, getting from the positive to the superlative at a jump, and diminishing the distance between them, "you need to what?" "To watch for you," said Leoline, in a sly whisper, "and so I have got to know you very well." "My own darling! And oh, Leoline, dare I hope, that you do not altogether hate me?" Leoline looked reflective, though her bleak eyes were sparkling under their sweeping lashes. "Why, no," she said demurely, "I don't know as I do. It's very sinful and improper to hate one's fellow creatures, you know, Sir Norman, and therefore I don't indulge in it." "Ah, you are given to piety, I see. In that case, perhaps, you are aware of a precept commanding us to love our neighbors. Now, I'm your nearest neighbor at present, so, to keep up a consistent Christian spirit, just to be good enough to say you love me?" Again Leoline laughed, and this time the bright, dancing eyes beamed, and their sparkling darkness fell upon him. "I'm afraid your theology is not very sound, my friend, and I have a dislike to extremes. There is a middle course between hating and loving. Suppose I take that." "I will have no middle courses. Either hating or loving it must be. Leoline, Leoline," bending over her and imprisoning both hands this time, "do say you love me." "I am captive in your hands, so I must, I suppose. Yes, Sir Norman, I do love you." Every man hearing that for the first time from a pair of loved lips is privileged to go mad for a brief season, and to go through certain maneuvers much more delectable to the enjoyers than to society at large. For fully 10 minutes after Leoline's last speech there was profound silence; but actions sometimes speak louder than words, and Leoline was perfectly convinced that her declaration had not fallen on insensible ears. At the end of that period the space between them on the couch had so greatly diminished that the ghost of a zephyr would have been crushed to death trying to get between them, and Sir Norman's face was fairly radiant. Leoline herself looked rather beaming, and she suddenly and without provocation burst into a merry little peal of laughter. "Well, for two people who were perfect strangers to each other half an hour ago, I think we have gone on remarkably well. What will Ormistan and Prudence say, I wonder, when they hear this?" "They will say what is the truth, that I am the luckiest man in England. Oh, Leoline, I have never thought it was in me to love anyone as I do you." "I am very glad to hear it; but I knew that it was in me long before I ever dreamed of knowing you. Are you not anxious to know something about the future Lady Kingsley's past history?" "It will all come in good time. It is not well to have a surfeit of joy in one night." "I do not know that this will add to your joy; but it had better be told and be done with at once and forever. In the first place, I presume I am an orphan, for I have never known father or mother, and I have never had any other name but Leoline." "So Ormistan told me." "My first recollection is of Prudence. She was my nurse and governess, both in one, and we lived in a cottage by the sea, I don't know where, but a long way from this. When I was about 10 years old, we left it, and came to London, and lived in a house in Cheapside for 5 or 6 years, and then we moved here. And all this time, Sir Norman, you will think it strange, but I never made any friends or acquaintances, and knew no one but Prudence and an old Italian professor, who came to our lodgings in Cheapside every week to give me lessons. It was not because I disliked society, you must know, but Prudence, with all her kindness and goodness, and I believe she truly loves me, has been nothing more or less all my life than my jailer." She paused to clasp a belt of silver brocade, fastened by a pearl buckle, close around her little waist, and Sir Norman fixed his eyes upon her beautiful face with a powerful glance. "Knew no one? That is strange, Leoline. Not even the Count L'Estrange? Ah, you know him?" she cried eagerly, lifting her eyes with a bright look. Do tell me who he is." "Upon my honor, my dear," said Sir Norman, considerably taken aback, "it strikes me you are the person to answer that question. If I don't greatly mistake, somebody told me you were going to marry him." "Oh, so I was," said Leoline, with the utmost simplicity; "but I don't know him, for all that. And more than that, Sir Norman, I do not believe his name is Count L'Estrange any more than mine is." "Precisely my opinion; but why, in the name of No, I'll not swear. But why were you going to marry him, Leoline?" Leoline half pouted and shrugged her pretty pink satin shoulders. "Because I couldn't help it, that's why. He coaxed and coaxed, and I said no and no and no, until I got tired of it. Prudence, too, was as bad as he was, until between them I got about distracted, and at last consented to marry him to get rid of him." "My poor persecuted little darling! Oh," cried Sir Norman, with a burst of enthusiasm, "how I should admire to have Count L'Estrange here for about 10 minutes just now! I would spoil his next wooing for him, or I am mistaken." "No, no," cried Leoline, looking rather alarmed. "You must not fight, you know. I shouldn't at all like either of you to get killed. Besides, he has not married me, and so there's no harm done." Sir Norman seemed rather struck by that view of the case, and after a few moments' reflection on it, came to the conclusion that she knew best, and settled down peaceably again. "Why do you suppose his name is not Count L'Estrange?" he asked. "For many reasons. First, he is disguised, wears false whiskers, mustache, and wig, and even the voice he uses appears assumed. Then Prudence seems in the greatest awe of him, and she is not one to be easily awed. I never knew her to be in the slightest degree intimidated by any human being but himself and that mysterious woman, La Masque." "Ah, you know La Masque, then?" "Not personally, but I have seen her as I did you, you remember," with an arch glance, "and, like you, being once seen is not to be forgotten." Sir Norman promptly paid her for the compliment in Cupid's own coin. "Little flatterer, I can almost forgive Count L'Estrange for wanting to marry you, for I presume he is only a man, and not quite equal to impossibilities. How long is it since you first knew him?" "Not 2 months. My courtship," said Leoline, with a gay laugh, "seemed destined to be of the shortest. He saw me one evening in the window, and immediately insisted on being admitted; and after that he continued coming until I had to promise, as I have told you, to be the Countess L'Estrange. He cannot be much of a gentleman, or he would not attempt to force a lady against her will. And so, when you were dressed for your bridal, you found you had the plague?" "Yes, Sir Norman; and horrible as that was, I do assure you I almost preferred it to marrying him." "Leoline, tell me how long it is since you have known me." "Nearly 3 months," said Leoline, blushing again, celestial rosy red. "And how long have you loved me?" "Nonsense! What a question! I shall not tell you." "You shall, you must! I insist upon it. Did you love me before you met the count? Out with it." "Well, then, yes," cried Leoline, desperately. Sir Norman raised the hand he held in rapture to his lips. "My darling! But I will reserve my raptures, for it is growing late, and I know you must want to go to rest. I have 1,000 things to tell you, but they must wait for daylight. Only I will promise, before parting, that this is the last night you must spend here." Leoline opened her bright eyes very wide. "Tomorrow morning," went on Sir Norman, impressively and with dignity, "you will be up and dressed by sunrise, and shortly after that radiant period I will make my appearance, with 2 horses, one of which I shall ride, and the other I shall lead. The one I lead you shall mount, and we will ride to the nearest church, and be married without any pomp or pageant. And then Sir Norman and Lady Kingsley will immediately leave London, and in Kingsley Castle, Devonshire, will enjoy the honeymoon and blissful repose till the plague is over. Do you understand that?" "Perfectly," she answered, with a radiant face. "And agree to it?" "You know I do, Sir Norman. Only " "Well, my pet, only what?" "Sir Norman, I should like to see Prudence. I want Prudence. How can I leave her behind?" "My dear child, she made nothing of leaving you when she thought you were dying. So never mind Prudence, but say, will you be ready?" "I will." "That is my good little Leoline. Now give me a kiss, Lady Kingsley, and good night." Lady Kingsley dutifully obeyed, and Sir Norman went out with a glow in his heart like a halo round a full moon. Chapter 10.
The Ten of the Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessie. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming, Chapter 10. The Page, the Fires, and the Fall. The night was intensely dark when Sir Norman got into it once more, and to anyone else would have been intensely dismal, but to Sir Norman all was bright as the fair hills of Beulah. When all is bright within, we see no darkness without, and just at that moment our young knight had got into one of those green and golden glimpses of sunshine that here and there checker life's rather dark pathway, and with Leoline beside him would have thought the dreary shores of the Dead Sea itself a very paradise. It was now near midnight, and there was an unusual concourse of people in the streets, waiting for St. Paul's to give the signal to light the fires. He looked around for Ormistan, but Ormistan was nowhere to be seen. Horse and rider had disappeared. His own horse stood tethered where he had left him. Anxious as he was to ride back to the ruin and see the play played out, he could not resist the temptation of lingering a brief period in the city, to behold the grand spectacle of the myriad fires. Many persons were hurrying towards St. Paul's to witness it from the dome, and, consigning his horse to the care of the sentinel on guard at the house opposite, he joined them and was soon striding along at a tremendous pace toward the great cathedral. Ere he reached it, its long-tongued clock tolled 12, and all the other churches, one after another, took up the sound, and the witching hour of midnight rang and re-rang from end to end of London town. As if by magic, 1,000 forked tongues of fire shot up at once into the blind, black night, turning almost in an instant the darkened face of the heavens to an inflamed, glowing red. Great fires were blazing around the cathedral when they reached it, but no one stopped to notice them, but only hurried on the faster to gain the point of observation. Sir Norman just glanced at the magnificent pile, for the old St. Paul's was even more magnificent than the new, and then followed after the rest, through many a gallery, tower, and spiral staircase till the dome was reached. And there a grand and mighty spectacle was before him. The whole of London swaying and heaving in one great sea of fire. From one end to the other the city seemed wrapped in sheets of flame, and every street and alley and lane within it shone in a lurid radiance far brighter than noonday. All along the river fires were gleaming too, and the whole sky had turned from black to blood-red crimson. The streets were alive and swarming. It could scarcely be believed that the plague-infested city contained half so many people, and all were unusually hopeful and animated, for it was popularly believed that these fires would effectually check the pestilence. But the angry fiat of a mighty judge had gone forth, and the tremendous arm of the destroying angel was not to be stopped by the puny hand of man. It has been said the weather for weeks was unusually brilliant. Days of cloudless sunshine, nights of cloudless moonlight, and the air was warm and sultry enough for the month of August in the tropics. But now, while they looked, a vivid flash of lightning, from what quarter of the heavens no man knew, shot athwart the sky, followed by another and another, quick, sharp, and blinding. Then one great drop of rain fell like molten lead on the pavement, then a second and a third, quicker, faster, and thicker, until down it crashed in a perfect deluge. It did not wait to rain. It fell in floods, in great, slanting sheets of water, as if the very floodgates of heaven had opened for a second deluge. No one ever remembered to have seen such torrents fall, and the populace fled before it in wildest dismay. In 5 minutes every fire, from one extremity of London to the other, was quenched in the very blackness of darkness, and on that night the deepest gloom and terror reigned throughout the city. It was clear the hand of an avenging deity was in this, and he who had rained down fire on Sodom and Gomorrah had not lost his might. In 15 minutes the terrific flood was over. The dismal clouds cleared away. A pale, fair, silver moon shone serenely out and looked down on the black, charred heaps of ashes strewn through the streets of London. One by one the stars, that all night had been obscured, glanced and sparkled over the sky, and lit up with their soft pale light the doomed and stricken town. Everybody had quitted the dome in terror and consternation, and now Sir Norman, who had been lost in awe, suddenly bethought him of his ride to the ruin, and hastened to follow their example. Walking rapidly, not to say recklessly along, he abruptly knocked against some one sauntering leisurely before him, and nearly pitched headlong on the pavement. Recovering his centre of gravity by a violent effort, he turned to see the cause of the collision, and found himself accosted by a musical and foreign-accented voice. "Pardon," said the sweet and rather feminine tones. "It was quite an accident, I assure you, monsieur. I had no idea I was in anybody's way." Sir Norman looked at the voice, or rather in the direction whence it came, and found it proceeded from a lad in gay livery, whose clear, colourless face, dark eyes, and exquisite features were by no means unknown. The boy seemed to recognize him at the same moment, and slightly touched his gay cap. "Ah, it is Sir Norman Kingsley! Just the very person but one in the world that I wanted most to see." "Indeed! And, pray, whom have I the honour of addressing?" inquired Sir Norman, deeply edified by the cool familiarity of the accoster. "They call me Hubert, for want of a better name, I suppose," said the lad easily. "And may I ask, Sir Norman, if you are shod with 7-leagued boots, or if your errand is one of life and death, that you stride along at such a terrific rate?" "And what is that to you?" asked Sir Norman, indignant at his free and easy impudence. "Nothing, only I should like to keep up with you, if my legs were long enough, and as they are not, and as company is not easily to be had in these forlorn streets, I should feel obliged to you if you would just slacken your pace a trifle and take me in tow." The boy's face in the moonlight, in everything but expression, was exactly that of Leoline, to which softening circumstance may be attributed Sir Norman's yielding to the request, and allowing the page to keep alongside. "I have met you once before to-night?" inquired Sir Norman, after a prolonged and wondering stare at him. "Yes, I have a faint recollection of seeing you and Mr. Ormistan on London Bridge a few hours ago, and, by the way, perhaps I may mention I am now in search of that same Mr. Ormistan." "You are? And what may you want of him, pray?" "Just a little information of a private character. Perhaps you can direct me to his whereabouts." "Should be happy to oblige you, my dear boy, but unfortunately I cannot. I want to see him myself, if I could find any one good enough to direct me to him. Is your business pressing?" "Very. There is a lady in the case, and such business, you are aware, is always pressing. Probably you have heard of her? A youthful angel in virgin white, who took a notion to jump into the Thames not a great while ago." "Ah!" said Sir Norman, with a start that did not escape the quick eyes of the boy. "And what do you want of her?" The page glanced at him. "Perhaps you know her yourself, Sir Norman? If so, you will answer quite as well as your friend, as I only want to know where she lives." "I have been out of town to-night," said Sir Norman, evasively, "and there may have been more ladies than one jumped into the Thames during my absence. Pray, describe your angel in white." "I did not notice her particularly myself," said the boy, with easy indifference, "as I am not in the habit of paying much attention to young ladies who run wild about the streets at night and jump promiscuously into rivers. However, this one was rather remarkable, for being dressed as a bride, having long black hair, and a great quantity of jewellery about her, and looking very much like me. Having said she looks like me, I need not add she is handsome." "Vanity of vanities, all in vanity," murmured Sir Norman, meditatively. "Perhaps she is a relative of yours, Master Hubert, since you take such an interest in her, and she looks so much like you." "Not that I know of," said Hubert, in his careless way. "I believe I was born minus those common domestic afflictions, relatives, and I don't take the slightest interest in her either, don't think it." "Then why are you in search of her?" "For a very good reason. Because I've been ordered to do so." "By whom? Your master?" "My Lord Rochester," said that nobleman's page, waving off the insinuation by a motion of his hand and a little displeased frown. He picked her up adrift, and being composed of highly inflammable materials, took a hot and vehement fancy for her, which fact he did not discover until your friend, Mr. Ormistan, had carried her off. Sir Norman scowled. "And so he sent you in search of her, has he?" "Exactly so. And now you perceive the reason why it is quite important that I find Mr. Ormistan. We do not know where he has taken her to, but fancy it must be somewhere near the river." "You do? I tell you what it is, my boy," exclaimed Sir Norman, suddenly and in an elevated key. "The best thing you can do is to go home and go to bed, and never mind young ladies. You'll catch the plague before you'll catch this particular young lady, I can tell you that." "Monsieur is excited," lisped the lad, raising his hat and running his taper fingers through his glossy dark curls. "Is she as handsome as they say she is, I wonder?" "Handsome!" cried Sir Norman, lighting up with quite a new sensation at the recollection. "I tell you, handsome doesn't begin to describe her. She is beautiful, lovely, angelic, divine." Here Sir Norman's litany of adjectives beginning to give out, he came to a sudden halt, with a face as radiant as the sky at sunrise. "Ah, I did not believe them when they told me she was so much like me, but if she is as near perfection as you describe, I shall begin to credit it. Strange, is it not, that nature should make a duplicate of her greatest earthly chef d'oeuvre?" "You conceited young jackanapes!" growled Sir Norman, in deep displeasure. "It is far stranger how such a bundle of vanity can contrive to live in this workaday world. You are a foreigner, I perceive." "Yes, Sir Norman, I am happy to say I am." "You don't like England, then?" "I'd be sorry to like it. A dirty, beggarly, sickly place as I ever saw." Sir Norman eyed the slender specimen of foreign manhood, uttering this sentiment in the sincerest of tones, and let his hand fall heavily on his shoulder. "My good youth, be careful. I happen to be a native, and not altogether used to this sort of talk. How long have you been here? Not long, I know myself, at least not in the Earl of Rochester's service, or I would have seen you." "Right, I have not been here a month, but that month has seemed longer than a year elsewhere. Do you know, I imagine when the world was created, this island of yours must have been made late on Saturday night, and then merely thrown in from the refuse to fill up a dent in the ocean." Sir Norman paused in his walk, and contemplated the speaker a moment in severest silence. But Master Hubert only lifted up his saucy face and laughing black eyes, in dauntless sang-froid. "Master Hubert," began Master Hubert's companion in his deepest and sternest bass. "I don't know your other name, and it would be of no consequence if I did. Just listen to me a moment. If you don't want to get run through, you perceive I carry a sword, and have an untimely end put to your career, just keep a civil tongue in your head and don't slander England. Now come on." Hubert laughed and shrugged his shoulders. "Thought is free, however, so I can have my own opinion in spite of everything. Will you tell me, monsieur, where I can find the lady?" "You will have it, will you?" exclaimed Sir Norman, half drawing his sword. "Don't ask questions, but answer them. Are you French?" "Monsieur has guessed it." "How long have you been with your present master?" "Monsieur, I object to that term," said Hubert with calm dignity. "Master is a vulgarism that I dislike. So, in alluding to his lordship, take the trouble to say patron." Sir Norman laughed. "With all my heart. How long, then, have you been with your present patron?" "Not quite 2 weeks." I do not like to be impertinently inquisitive in addressing so dignified a gentleman, but perhaps you would not consider it too great a liberty if I inquired how you became his page. "Monsieur shall ask as many questions as he pleases, and it shall not be considered the slightest liberty," said the young gentleman, politely. "I had been roaming at large about the city and the palace of his majesty, whom may Heaven preserve, and grant a little more wisdom, in search of a situation, and among that of all nobles of the court, the Earl of Rochester's livery struck me as being the most becoming, and so I concluded to patronize him." "What an honor for his lordship! Since you dislike England so much, however, you will probably soon throw up the situation and patronize the first foreign ambassador." "Perhaps. I rather like Whitehall, however. Old Rowley has taken rather a fancy to me," said the boy, speaking with the same easy familiarity of his majesty as he would of a lap-dog. "And what is better, so has Mistress Stuart; so much so, that Heaven forfend the king should become jealous. This, however, is strictly entre nous, and not to be spoken of on any terms." "Your secret shall be preserved at the risk of my life," said Sir Norman, laying his hand on the left side of his doublet. "And in return, may I ask if you have any relatives living, any sisters, for instance?" "I see you have a suspicion that the lady in white may be a sister of mine. Well, you may set your mind at rest on that point; for if she is, it is news to me, as I never saw her in my life before to-night. Is she a particular friend of yours, Sir Norman?" "Never you mind that, my dear boy; but take my advice, and don't trouble yourself looking for her, for, most assuredly, if you find her, I shall break your head." "Much obliged," said Hubert, touching his cap; "but, nevertheless, I shall risk it. She had the plague, though, when she jumped into the river, and perhaps the best place to find her would be the pest house. I shall try." "Go, and Heaven speed you! Yonder is the way to it, and my road lies here. Good night, Master Hubert." "Good night, Sir Norman," responded the page, bowing airily; "and if I do not find the lady to-night, most assuredly I shall do so to-morrow." Turning along a road leading to the pest house, and laughing as he went, the boy disappeared. Fearing lest the page should follow him, and thereby discover a clue to Leoline's abode, Sir Norman turned into a street some distance from the house, and waited in the shadow until he was out of sight. Then he came forth, and, full of impatience to get back to the ruin, hurried on to where he had left his horse. He was still in the care of the watchman, whom he repaid for his trouble; and as he sprang on his back, he glanced up at the windows of Leoline's house. It was all buried in profound darkness, but that one window from which that faint light streamed, and he knew that she had not yet gone to rest. For a moment he lingered and looked at it in the absurd way lovers will look, and was presently rewarded by seeing what he watched for. A shadow flit between him and the light. The sight was a strong temptation to him to dismount and enter, and, under pretence of warning her against the Earl of Rochester and his pretty page, see her once again. But reflection, stepping rebukingly up to him, whispered indignantly that his lady-love was probably by this time in her night-robe, and not at home to lovers; and Sir Norman respectfully bowed to reflection's superior wisdom. He thought of Hubert's words, "If I do not find her to-night, I shall most assuredly to-morrow," and a chill presentiment of coming evil fell upon him. "To-morrow," he said, as he turned to go. "Who knows what to-morrow may bring forth? Fairest and dearest Leoline, good night." He rode away in the moonlight, with the stars shining peacefully down upon him. His heart at the moment was a divided one half being given to Leoline, and the other to the Midnight Queen and her mysterious court. The farther he went away from Leoline, the dimmer her star became in the horizon of his thoughts; and the nearer he came to Miranda, the brighter and more eagerly she loomed up, until he spurred his horse to a most furious gallop, lest he should find the castle and the queen lost in the regions of space when he got there. Once the plague-stricken city lay behind him, his journey was short; and soon, to his great delight, he turned into the silent, deserted by-path leading to the ruin. Tying his horse to a stake in the crumbling wall, he paused for a moment to look at it in the pale, wan light of the midnight moon. He had looked at it many a time before, but never with the same interest as now, and the ruined battlements, the fallen roof, the broken windows, and mouldering sides, had all a new and weird interest for him. No one was visible far or near, and feeling that his horse was secure in the shadow of the wall, he entered and walked lightly and rapidly along in the direction of the spiral staircase. With more haste, but the same precaution, he descended and passed through the walls, to where he knew the loose flagstone was. It was well he did know, for there was neither strain of music nor ray of light to guide him now, and his heart sank to zero as he thought he might raise the stone and discover nothing. His hand positively trembled with eagerness as he lifted it, and with unbounded delight not to be described, looked down on the same titled assembly he had watched before. But there had been a change since. Half the lights were extinguished, and the great vaulted room was comparatively in shadow. The music had entirely died away, and all was solemnly silent. But what puzzled Sir Norman most of all was the fact that there seemed to be a trial of acme sort going on. A long table, covered with green velvet, and looking not unlike a modern billiard table, stood at the right of the queen's crimson throne, and behind it, perched in a high chair, and wearing a long, solemn black robe, sat a small, thick personage whose skin Sir Norman would have known on a bush. He glanced at the lower throne, and found it as he expected empty, and he saw at once that his little highness was not only prince consort, but also supreme judge in the kingdom. 2 or 3 similar black-robed gentry, among whom was recognizable the noble duke, who so narrowly escaped with his life under the swords of Sir Norman and Count L'Estrange. Before this solemn conclave stood a man who was evidently the prisoner under trial, and who wore the whitest and most frightened face Sir Norman thought he had ever beheld. The queen was lounging negligently back on her throne, paying very little attention to the solemn rites, occasionally gossiping with some of the snow-white sylphs beside her, and often yawning behind her pretty finger-tips, and evidently very much bored by it all. The rest of the company were decorously seated in the crimson and gilded armchairs, some listening with interest to what was going on, others holding whispered tete-a-tetes, and all very still and respectful. Sir Norman's interest was aroused to the highest pitch. He imprudently leaned forward too far, in order to hear and see, and lost his balance. He felt he was going, and tried to stop himself, but in vain; and seeing there was no help for it, he made a sudden spring, and landed right in the midst of the assembly. End of chapter 10.
The Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nienke. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming. Chapter 11. The Execution. In an instant, all was confusion. Everybody sprang to their feet. Ladies shrieked in chorus, gentlemen swore, and drew their swords, and looked to see if they might not expect a whole army to drop from the sky upon them as they stood. No other battalion, however, followed this forlorn hope, and seeing it, the gentlemen took heart of grace and closed around the unceremonious intruder. The queen had sprung from her royal seat, and stood with her bright lips parted, and her brighter eyes dilating in speechless wonder. The bench, with the judge at their head, had followed her example, and stood staring with all their might, looking, truth to tell, as much startled by the sudden apparition as the fair sex. The said fair sex was still firing off little volleys of screams in chorus, and clinging desperately to their cavaliers, and everything, in a word, was in most admired disorder. Tam O'Shanter's cry, "Well done, Cutty-sark!" could not have produced half such a commotion among his hellish legion as the emphatic debut of Sir Norman Kingsley among these human revellers. The only one who seemed rather to enjoy it than otherwise was the prisoner, who was quietly and quickly making off, when the malevolent and irrepressible dwarf espied him, and one shock acting as counter-irritant to the other, he bounced fleetly over the table and grabbed him in his crab-like claws. The ladies stopped screaming, the gentlemen ceased swearing, and more than one exclamation of astonishment followed the cries of terror. "Sir Norman Kingsley! Sir Norman Kingsley!" rang from lip to lip of those who recognized him, and all drew closer and looked at him, as if they really could not make up their minds to believe their eyes. As for Sir Norman himself, that gentleman was destined literally, if not metaphorically, to fall on his legs that night, and had alighted on the crimson velvet carpet, cat-like, on his feet. In reference to his feelings, his first was one of frantic disapproval of going down, his second one of intense astonishment of finding himself there with unbroken bones, his third a disagreeable conviction that he had about put his foot in it, and was in an excessively bad fix, and last, but not least, a firm and rooted determination to make the best of a bad bargain, and never say die. His first act was to take off his plumed hat, and make a profound obeisance to Her Majesty the Queen, who was altogether too much surprised to make the return politeness demanded, and merely stared at him with her great, beautiful, brilliant eyes, as if she would never have done. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Sir Norman, turning gracefully to the company, "I beg 10,000 pardons for this unwarrantable intrusion, and promise you, upon my honour, never to do it again. I beg to assure you that my coming here was altogether involuntary on my part, and forced by circumstances over which I had no control, and I entreat you will not mind me in the least, but go on with the proceedings just as you did before. Should you feel my presence here any restraint, I am quite ready and willing to take my departure at any moment, and, as I before insinuated, will promise on the honour of a gentleman and a knight never again to take the liberty of tumbling through the ceiling down on your heads." This reference to the ceiling seemed to explain the whole mystery, and everybody looked up at the corner whence he came from, and saw the flag that had been removed. As to his speech, everybody had listened to it with the greatest of attention, and sundry of the ladies, convinced by this time that he was flesh and blood, and no ghost, favoured the handsome young knight with divers glances, not at all displeased or unadmiring. The queen sank back into her seat, keeping him still transfixed with her darkly splendid eyes, and whether she admired or otherwise, no one could tell from her still, calm face. The Prince Consort's feelings, for such there could be no doubt he was, were involved in no such mystery, and he broke out into a hyena-like scream of laughter, as he recognized, upon a second look, his young friend of the Golden Crown. "So you have come, have you?" he cried, thrusting his unlovely visage over the table till it almost touched Sir Norman's. "You have come, have you, after all I said?" "Yes, sir, I have come," said Sir Norman, with a polite bow. "Perhaps you don't know me, my dear young sir, your little friend, you know, of the Golden Crown?" "Oh, I perfectly recognize you, my little friend," said Sir Norman, with bland suavity, and unconsciously quoting Leyline. "Once seen is not easily forgotten." Upon this, his Highness set up such another screech of mirth that it quite woke an echo through the room, and all Sir Norman's friends looked grave, for when his Highness laughed, it was a very bad sign. "My little friend will hurt himself," remarked Sir Norman with an air of solicitude, "if he indulges in his exuberant and gleeful spirits to such an extent. Let me recommend you, as a well-wisher, to sit down and compose yourself." Instead of complying, however, the Prince, who seems blessed with a lively sense of the ludicrous, was so struck with the extreme funniness of the young man's speech, that he relaxed into another paroxysm of levity, shriller and more unearthly, if possible, than any preceding one, and which left him so exhausted that he was forced to sink back into his chair and into silence through sheer fatigue. Seizing this, the first opportunity, Miranda, with a glance of displeased dignity at Caliban, immediately struck in. "Who are you, sir, and by what right do you dare to come here?" Her tone was neither very sweet nor suave, but it was much pleasanter to be cross-examined by the owner of such a pretty face than by the ugly little monster, for the moment gasping and extinguished, and Sir Norman turned to her with alacrity and a bow. "Madam, I am Sir Norman Kingsley, very much at your service, and I beg to assure you I did not come here, but fell here, through that hole, if you perceive, and very much against my will." "Equivocation will not serve you in this case, sir," said the Queen, with an austere dignity, "and, allow me to observe, it is just probable you would not have fallen through that hole in our royal ceiling if you had kept away from it. You raised that flag yourself, did you not?" "Madame, I fear I must say yes." "And why did you do so?" demanded her Majesty, with far more sharp asperity than Sir Norman dreamed could ever come from such beautiful lips. "The rumour of Queen Miranda's charms has gone forth, and I fear I must own that rumour drew me hither," responded Sir Norman, inventing a polite little work of fiction for the occasion. "And let me add, that I came to find that rumour had underrated instead of exaggerated her Majesty's sad charms." Here Sir Norman, whose spine seemed in danger of becoming the shape of a rainbow, in excess of good breeding, made another genuflection before the Queen, with his hand over the region of his heart. Miranda tried to look grave, and wear that expression of severe solemnity I am told queens and rich people always do, but, in spite of herself, a little pleased smile rippled over her face, and, noticing it, and the bow and speech, the Prince suddenly and sharply set up such another screech of laughter as no steamboat or locomotive, in the present age of steam, could begin to equal in ghastliness. "Will your Highness have the goodness to hold your tongue?" inquired the Queen, with much the air and look of Mrs. Caudle, "and allow me to ask this stranger a few questions uninterrupted. Sir Norman Kingsley, how long have you been above there, listening and looking on?" "Madame, I was not there 5 minutes, when suddenly, and to my great surprise, found myself here." "A lie! A lie!" exclaimed the dwarf, furiously. "It is over 2 hours since I met you at the bar of the Golden Crown." "My dear little friend," said Sir Norman, drawing his sword and flourishing it within an inch of the royal nose, "just make that remark again, and my sword will cleave your pretty head, as the scimitar of Saladin clove the cushion of down. I earnestly assure you, madame, that I had but just knelt down to look, when I discovered to my dismay that I was no longer there, but in your charming presence." "In that case, my lords and gentlemen," said the Queen, glancing blandly around the apartment, "he has witnessed nothing, and therefore merits but a slight punishment." "Permit me, your Majesty," said the Duke, who had read the roll of death, and who had been eyeing Sir Norman sharply for some time. "Permit me one moment. This is the very individual who slew the Earl of Ashley while his companion was doing for my Lord Craven. Sir Norman Kingsley," said his Grace, turning with awful impressiveness to that young person. "Do you know me?" "Quite as well as I wish to," answered Sir Norman, with a cool and rather contemptuous glance in his direction. "You look extremely like a certain highwayman with the most villainous countenance I encountered a few hours back, and whom I would have made mince of if he had not been coward enough to fly. Probably you may be the name. You look fit for that, or anything else." "Cut him down! Dash his brains out! Run him through! Shoot him!" were a few of the mild and pleasant insinuations that went off on every side of him, like a fierce volley of popguns, and a score of bright blades flashed blue and threatening on every side, while the prince broke out into another shriek of laughter that rang high over all. Sir Norman drew his own sword, and stood in the defence, breathed one thought to Leyline, gave himself up for lost, but before quite doing so, to use a phrase not altogether as original as it might be, determined to sell his life as dearly as possible. Angry eyes and fierce faces were on every hand, and his dreams of matrimony and Leyline seemed about to terminate then and there, when luck came to his side in the shape of Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen. Springing to her feet, she waved her sceptre, while her black eyes flashed as fiercely as the best of them, and her voice rang out like a trumpet tone. "Sheathe your swords, my lords, and back, every man of you! Not one hair of his head shall fall without my permission, and the first who lays hands on him until that consent is given shall die, if I have to shoot him myself. Sir Norman Kingsley, stand near, and fear not. At his peril, let one of them touch you." Norman bent one knee, and raised the gracious hand to his lips. At the fierce, ringing, imperious tone, all involuntarily fell back, as if they were accustomed to obey it, and the prince, who seemed to-night in an uncommonly facetious mood, laughed again, long and shrill. "What are your majesty's commands?" asked the discomfited duke, rather sulkily. "Is this insulting interloper to go free?" "That is no affair of yours, my lord duke," answered the spirited voice of the queen. "Be good enough to finish Lord Gloucester's trial, and until then I will be responsible for the safekeeping of Sir Norman Kingsley." "And after that he is to go free, your majesty?" said the dwarf, laughing to that extent that he ran the risk of rupturing an artery. "After that it shall be precisely as I please," replied the ringing voice, while the black eyes flashed anything but loving glances upon him. "While I am queen here, I shall be obeyed. When I am queen no longer, you may do as you please. My lords," turning her passionate, beautiful face to the hushed audience, "am I or am I not sovereign here?" "Madame, you alone are our sovereign lady and queen." "Then, when I condescend to command, you shall obey. Do you, your highness, and you, Lord Duke, go on with the Earl of Gloucester's trial, and I will be the stranger's jailer." "She is right," said the dwarf, his fierce little eyes gleaming with a malignant light. "Let us do one thing before another, and after we have settled Gloucester here, we will attend to this man's case. Guards, keep a sharp eye on your new prisoner. Ladies and gentlemen, be good enough to resume your seats. Now, your grace, continue the trial." "Where did we leave off?" inquired his grace, looking rather at a loss, and scowling vengeance dire at the handsome queen and her handsome protégé, as he sank back in his chair of state. "The earl was confessing his guilt, or about to do so. Pray, my lord," said the dwarf, glaring upon the pallid prisoner, "were you not saying you had betrayed us to the king?" A breathless silence followed the question. Everybody seemed to hold his very breath to listen. Even the queen leaned forward and awaited the answer eagerly, and the many eyes that had been riveted on Sir Norman since his entrance left him now for the first time and settled on the prisoner. A piteous spectacle that prisoner was, his face whiter than the snowy nymphs behind the throne, and so distorted with fear, fury, and guilt, that it looked scarcely human. Twice he opened his eyes to reply, and twice all sounds died away in a choking gasp. "Do you hear his highness?" sharply inquired the Lord High Chancellor, reaching over the great seal, and giving the unhappy Earl of Gloucester a rap on the head with it. "Why do you not answer?" "Pardon, pardon!" exclaimed the Earl in a husky whisper. "Do not believe the tales they tell you of me. For heaven's sake, spare my life!" "Confess!" thundered the dwarf, striking the table with his clenched fist until all the papers thereon jumped spasmodically into the air. "Confess at once, or I shall run you through where you stand!" The Earl, with a perfect screech of terror, flung himself flat upon his face and hands before the Queen, with such force that Sir Norman expected to see his countenance make a hole in the floor. "Oh, madame, spare me! Spare me! Spare me! Have mercy on me as you hope for mercy yourself!" She recoiled, and drew back her very garments from his touch, as if that touch was pollution, eyeing him the while with a glance frigid and pitiless as death. "There is no mercy for traitors," she coldly said. "Confess your guilt, and expect no pardon from me." "Lift him up!" shouted the dwarf, clawing the air with his hands, as if he could have clawed the heart out of his victim's body. "Back with him to his place, guards, and see that he does not leave it again." Squirming and writhing and twisting himself in their grasp, in very uncomfortable and eel-like fashion, the Earl was dragged back to his place, and forcibly held there by two of the guards, while his face grew so ghastly and convulsed that Sir Norman turned away his head, and could not bear to look at it. "Confess!" once more yelled the dwarf in a terrible voice, while his still more terrible eyes flashed sparks of fire. "Confess, or by all that's sacred it shall be tortured out of you. Guards, bring me the thumbscrews, and let us see if they will not exorcise the dumb devil by which our ghastly friend is possessed." "No, no, no!" shrieked the Earl, while the foam flew from his lips. "I confess! I confess! I confess!" "Good! And what do you confess?" said the Duke blandly, leaning forward, while the dwarf fell back with a yell of laughter at the success of his ruse. "I confess all, everything, anything, only spare my life." "Do you confess to having taught Charles, King of England, the secrets of our kingdom and this place?" said the Duke, sternly rapping down the petition with a roll of parchment. The Earl grew, if possible, a more ghastly white. "I do, I must, but oh, for the love of—" "Never mind love," cut in the inexorable Duke. "It is a subject that has nothing whatsoever to do with the present case. Did you or did you not receive for the aforesaid information a large sum of money?" "I did, but my lord, spare—" "Which sum of money you have concealed," continued the Duke, with another frown and a sharp rap. "Now the question is, where have you concealed it?" "I will tell you, with all my heart, only spare my life." "Tell us first, and we will think about your life afterward." "Let me advise you, as a friend, my lord, to tell at once, and truthfully," said the Duke, toying negligently with the thumbscrews. "It is buried at the north corner of the old wall at the head of Bradshaw's grave. You shall have that and 1,000-fold more, if you will only pardon—" "Enough!" broke in the dwarf, with the look and tone of an exultant demon. "That is all we want. My lord Duke, give me the death warrant, and while her majesty signs it, I will pronounce his doom." The Duke handed him a roll of parchment, which he glanced critically over, and handed to the Queen for her autograph. That royal lady spread the vellum on her knee, took the pen, and affixed her signature as coolly as if she were inditing a sonnet in an album. Then his Highness, with a face that fairly scintillated with demonic delight, stood up and fixed his eyes on the ghastly prisoner, and spoke in a voice that reverberated like the tolling of a death bell through the room. "My Lord Gloucester, you have been tried by a council of your fellow peers, presided over by her royal self, and found guilty of high treason. Your sentence is that you be taken hence, immediately, to the block, and there be beheaded, in punishment of your crime." His Highness wound up this somewhat solemn speech, rather inconsistently, bursting out into one of his shrillest peals of laughter, and the miserable Earl of Gloucester, with a gasping, unearthly cry, fell back in the arms of the attendants. Dead and oppressive silence reigned, and Sir Norman, who half believed all along the whole thing was a farce, began to feel an uncomfortable sense of chill creeping over him, and to think that, though practical jokes were excellent things in their way, there was yet a possibility of carrying them a little too far. The disagreeable silence was first broken by the dwarf, who, after gloating for a moment over his victim's convulsive spasms, sprang nimbly from his chair of dignity and held out his arm to the Queen. The queen arose, which seemed to be a sign for everybody else to do the same, and all began forming themselves in a sort of line of march. "What is to be done with this other prisoner, your highness?" inquired the duke, making a poke with his forefinger at Sir Norman. "Is he to stay here, or is he to accompany us?" His highness turned around, and putting his face close up to Sir Norman's, favoured him with a malignant grin. "You'd like to come, wouldn't you, my dear young friend?" "Really," said Sir Norman, drawing back and returning the dwarf's stare with compound interest, "that depends altogether on the nature of the entertainment, but, at the same time, I am much obliged to you for consulting my inclinations." This reply nearly overset his highness's gravity once more, but he checked his mirth after the first irresistible squeal, and finding the company were all arranged in the order of going, and awaiting his sovereign pleasure, he turned. "Let him come," he said, with his countenance still distorted by inward merriment. "It will do him good to see how we punish offenders here, and teach him what he is to expect himself. Is your majesty ready?" "My majesty has been ready and waiting for the last 5 minutes," replied the lady, overlooking his proffered hand with grand disdain, and stepping down lightly from her throne. Her rising was the signal for the unseen band to strike up a grand triumphant Io Paean, though, had the Rogue's March been a popular melody in those times, it would have suited the procession much more admirably. The queen and the dwarf went first, and a vivid contrast they were. She so young, so beautiful, so proud, so disdainfully cold; he so ugly, so stunted, so deformed, so fiendish. After them went the band of sylphs in white, then the chancellor, archbishop, and ambassadors, next the whole court of ladies and gentlemen, and after them Sir Norman, in the custody of 2 of the soldiers. The condemned earl came last, or rather allowed himself to be dragged by his 4 guards, for he seemed to have become perfectly palsied and dumb with fear. Keeping time to the triumphant march, and preserving dismal silence, the procession wound its way along the room and through the great archway heretofore hidden by the tapestry now lifted lightly by the nymphs. A long stone passage, carpeted with crimson and gold, and brilliantly illuminated like the grand saloon they had left, was thus revealed, and 3 similar archways appeared at the extremity, one to the right and left, and one directly before them. The procession passed through the one on the left, and Sir Norman started in dismay to find himself in the most gloomy apartment he had ever beheld in his life. It was all covered with black, walls, ceiling, and floor were draped in black, and reminded him forcibly of Masque's Chamber of Horrors, only this was more repellent. It was lighted, or rather, the gloom was troubled, by a few spectral tapers of black wax in ebony candlesticks, that seemed absolutely to turn black, and make the horrible place more horrible. There was no furniture, neither couch, chair, nor table, nothing but a sort of stage at the upper end of the room, with something that looked like a seat upon it, and both were shrouded with the same dismal drapery. But it was no seat, for everybody stood, arranging themselves silently and noiselessly around the walls, with the queen and the dwarf at their head, and near this elevation stood a tall black statue, wearing a mask, and leaning on a bright, dreadful, glittering axe. The music changed to an unearthly dirge, so weird and blood-curdling that Sir Norman could have put his hand over his eardrums to shut out the ghastly sound. The dismal room, the voiceless spectators, the black spectre with the glittering axe, the fearful music, struck a chill to his inmost heart. Could it be possible they were really going to murder the unhappy wretch? And could all those beautiful ladies, could that surpassingly beautiful queen, stand there serenely, unmoved, to witness such a crime? While he yet looked around in horror, the doomed man, already apparently almost dead with fear, was dragged forward by his guards. Paralyzed as he was, at sight of the stage which he knew to be the scaffold, he uttered shriek after shriek of frenzied despair, and struggled like a madman to get free. But as well might Laocoon have struggled in the folds of the serpent. They pulled him on, bound him hand and foot, and held his head forcibly down on the block. The black spectre moved, the dwarf made a signal, the glittering axe was raised, fell, a scream was cut in two, A bright jet of blood spouted up in the soldiers' faces, blinding them. The axe fell again, and the Earl of Gloucester was minus that useful and ornamental appendage, a head. It was all over so quickly that Sir Norman could scarcely believe his horrified senses until the deed was done. The executioner threw a black cloth over the bleeding trunk, and held up the grisly head by the hair, and Sir Norman could have sworn the features moved, and the dead eyes rolled round the room. "Behold!" cried the executioner, striking the convulsed face with the palm of his open hand, "the fate of all traitors!" "And of all spies!" exclaimed the dwarf, glaring with his fiendish eyes upon the appalled Sir Norman. "Keep your axe sharp and bright, Mr. Executioner, for before morning dawns there is another gentleman here to be made shorter by a head." End of chapter 11.
12 of the Midnight Queen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessie. The Midnight Queen by May Agnes Fleming, Chapter 12. Doom. "Let us go," said the Queen, glancing at the revolting sight, and turning away with a shudder of repulsion. "Faugh! The sight of blood has made me sick." "And taken away my appetite for supper," added a youthful and elegant beauty beside her. "My Lord Gloucester was hideous enough when living, but, mon Dieu, he's 10 times more so when dead." "Your ladyship will not have the same story to tell of yonder stranger when he shares the same fate in an hour or two," said the dwarf, with a malicious grin. "For I heard you remarking upon his extreme beauty when he first appeared." The lady laughed and bowed, and turned her bright eyes upon Sir Norman. "True, it is almost a pity to cut such a handsome head off, is it not? I wish I had a voice in your highness's council, and I know what I should do." "What, Lady Mountjoy?" "Entreat him to swear fealty, and become one of us, and—" "And a bridegroom for your ladyship?" suggested the Queen, with a curling lip. "I think if Sir Norman Kingsley knew Lady Mountjoy as well as I do, he would even prefer the block to such a fate." Lady Mountjoy's brilliant eyes shone like 2 angry meteors, but she merely bowed and laughed, and the laugh was echoed by the dwarf in his shrillest falsetto. "Does your highness intend remaining here all night?" demanded the Queen rather fiercely. "If not, the sooner we leave this ghastly place, the better. The play is over, and supper is waiting." With which the royal virago made an imperious motion for her attendant sprites in gossamer white to precede her, and turned with her accustomed stately step to follow. The music immediately changed from its doleful dirge to a spirited measure, and the whole company flocked after her, back to the great room of state. There they all paused, hovering in uncertainty around the room, while the Queen, holding her purple train up lightly in one hand, stood at the foot of the throne, glancing at them with her cold, haughty, and beautiful eyes. In their wandering, those same darkly splendid eyes glanced and lighted on Sir Norman, who, in a state of seeming stupor at the horrible scene he had just witnessed, stood near the green table, and they sent a thrill through him with their wonderful resemblance to Leoline's. So vividly alike were they, that he half doubted for a moment whether she and Leoline were not really one. But no, Leoline never could have had the cold, cruel heart to stand and witness such a horrible sight. Miranda's dark, piercing glance fell as haughtily and disdainfully on him as it had on the rest, and his heart sank as he thought that whatever sympathy she had felt for him was entirely gone. It might have been a whim, a woman's caprice, a spirit of contradiction, that had induced her to defend him at first. Whatever it was, and it mattered not now, it had completely vanished. No face of marble could have been colder, or stonier, or harder than hers, as she looked at him out of the depths of her great dark eyes, and with that look his last lingering hope of life vanished. "And now for the next trial!" exclaimed the dwarf, briskly breaking in upon his drab-colored meditations and bustling past. "We will get it over at once, and have done with it." "You will do no such thing," said the imperious voice of the queenly shrew. "We will have neither trials nor anything else until after supper, which has already been delayed 4 full minutes. My lord chamberlain, have the goodness to step in and see that all is in order." One of the gilded and decorated gentlemen, whom Sir Norman had mistaken for ambassadors, stepped off in obedience, through another opening in the tapestry, which seemed to be as extensively undermined with such apertures as a cabman's coat with capes. And, while he was gone, the queen stood drawn up to her full height, with a scornful face looking down on the dwarf. That small man knit up his very plain face into a bristle of the sourest kinks, and frowned sulky disapproval at an order which he either would not, or dared not, countermand. Probably the latter had most to do with it, as everybody looked hungry and mutinous, and a great deal more eager for their supper than the life of Sir Norman Kingsley. "Your Majesty, the royal banquet is waiting," insinuated the Lord High Chamberlain, returning and bending over until his face and his shoe buckles almost touched. "And what is to be done with this prisoner while we are eating it?" growled the dwarf, looking drawn swords at his liege lady. "He can remain here under care of the guards, can he not?" she retorted sharply. "Or, if you are afraid they are not equal to taking care of him, you had better stay and watch him yourself." With which answer her Majesty sailed majestically away, leaving the gentleman addressed to follow or not, as he pleased. It pleased him to do so on the whole, and he went after her, growling anathemas between his royal teeth, and evidently in the same state of mind that induces gentlemen in private life to take sticks to their aggravating spouses under similar circumstances. However, it might not be just the thing, perhaps, for kings and queens to take broomsticks to settle their little differences of opinion like common Christians. And so the prince peaceably followed her and entered the salle à manger with the rest, and Sir Norman and his keepers were left in the hall of state, monarchs of all they surveyed. Notwithstanding he knew his hours were numbered, the young knight could not avoid feeling curious, and the tapestry having been drawn aside, he looked through the arch with a good deal of interest. The apartment was smaller than the one in which he stood, though still very large, and instead of being all crimson and gold, was glancing and glittering with blue and silver. These azure hangings were of satin instead of velvet, and looked quite light and cool compared to the hot glowing place where he was. The ceiling was spangled over with silver stars, with the royal arms quartered in the middle, and the chairs were of white polished wood, gleaming like ivory, and cushioned with blue satin. The table was of immense length, as it had need to be, and flashed and sparkled in the wax lights with heaps of gold and silver plate, cut glass, and precious porcelain. Golden and crimson wines shone in the carved decanters. Great silver baskets of fruit were strewn about, with piles of cakes and confectionery, not to speak of more solid substantials, wherein the heart of every true Englishman delighteth. The queen sat in a great raised chair at the head, and helped herself without paying much attention to anybody, and the remainder were ranged down its length according to their rank, which, as they were all pretty much dukes and duchesses, was about equal. The spirits of the company, depressed for a moment by the unpleasant little circumstance of seeing one of their number beheaded, seemed to revive under the spirituous influence of sherry, sack, and burgundy, and soon they were laughing and chatting and hobnobbing as animatedly as any dinner party Sir Norman had ever seen. The musicians, too, appeared to be in high feather, and the merriest music of the day assisted the noble banqueter's digestion. Under ordinary circumstances it was rather a tantalizing scene to stand aloof and contemplate, and so the guards very likely felt. But Sir Norman's thoughts were of that room in black, the headsman's axe, and Leoline. He felt he would never see her again, never see the sunrise that was to shine on their bridal, and he wondered what she would think of him, and if she was destined to fall into the hands of Lord Rochester or Count L'Estrange. As a general thing, our young friend was not given to melancholy moralizing, but in the present case, with the headsman's axe poised like the sword of Damocles above him by a single hair, he may be pardoned for reflecting that this world is all a fleeting show, and that he had got himself into a scrape to which the plague was a trifle. And yet, with nervous impatience, he wished that dinner and his trial were over, his fate sealed, and his life ended at once, since it was to be ended soon. For the fulfillment of the first wish he had not long to wait. The feast, though gay and grand, was of the briefest, and they could have scarcely been half an hour gone when they were all back. Everybody seemed in better humour, too, after the refection, but the queen and the dwarf. The former looked colder and harder, and more like a Labrador iceberg tricked out in purple velvet than ever, and his highness was grinning from ear to ear, which was the very worst possible sign. Not even her majesty could make the slightest excuse for delaying the trial now, and, indeed, that eccentric lady seemed to have no wish to do so had she the power, but seated herself in silent disdain of them all, and dropping her long lashes over her dark eyes, seemed to forget there was anybody in existence but herself. His highness and his nobles took their stations of authority behind the green table, and summoned the guards to lead the prisoner up before them, which was done, while the rest of the company were fluttering down into their seats, and evidently about to pay the greatest attention. The cases in this midnight court seemed to be conducted on a decidedly original plan, and with an easy rapidity that would have electrified any other court, ancient or modern. Sir Norman took his stand, and eyed his judges with a look half contemptuous, half defiant, and the proceedings commenced by the dwarf leaning forward and breaking into a roar of laughter right in his face. "My little friend, I warned you before not to be so facetious," said Sir Norman, regarding him quietly. "A rush of mirth to the brain will certainly be the death of you one of these days." "No levity, young man," interposed the Lord Chancellor, rebukingly. "Remember, you are addressing His Royal Highness Prince Caliban, spouse and consort of Her Most Gracious Majesty Miranda." "Indeed? Then all I have to say is, that Her Majesty has very bad taste in the selection of a husband, unless, indeed, her wish was to marry the ugliest man in the world, as she herself is the most beautiful of women." Her Majesty took not the slightest notice of this compliment, not so much as a flutter of her drooping eyelashes betrayed that she even heard it, but his highness laughed until he was perfectly hoarse. "Silence!" shouted the duke, shocked and indignant at this glaring disrespect, "and answer truthfully the questions put to you. Your name, you say, is Sir Norman Kingsley?" "Yes. Has your grace any objection to it?" His grace waved down the interruption with a dignified wave of the hand, and went on with severe judicial dignity. "You are the same who shot Lord Ashley between this and the city some hours ago?" "I had the pleasure of shooting a highwayman there, and my only regret is I did not perform the same good office by his companion in the person of your noble self before you turned and fled." A slight titter ran round the room, and the Duke turned crimson. "These remarks are impertinent and not to the purpose. You are the murderer of Lord Ashley, let that suffice. Probably you were on your way hither when you did the deed." "He was," said the dwarf vindictively. "I met him at the Golden Crown but a short time after." "Very well, that is another point settled, and either of them is strong enough to seal his death warrant. You came here as a spy, to see and hear and report. Probably you were sent by King Charles?" "Probably, just think as you please about it," said Sir Norman, who knew his case was as desperate as it could be, and was quite reckless what he answered. "You admit that you are a spy, then?" "No such thing. I have owned nothing. As I told you before, you are welcome to put what construction you please on my actions." "Sir Norman Kingsley, this is nonsensical equivocation. You own you came to hear and see?" "Well?" "Well, hearing and seeing constitute spying, do they not? Therefore you are a spy." "I confess it looks like it. What next?" "Need you ask? What is the fate of all spies?" "No matter what they are in other places, I am pretty certain what they are here." "And that is?" "A room in black, and a chop with an axe, the Earl of Gloucester's fate, in a word." "You have said it. Have you any reason why such a sentence should not be pronounced on you?" "None. Pronounce it as soon as you like." "With the greatest pleasure," said the Duke, who had been scrawling on another ominous roll of vellum, and now passed it to the dwarf. "I never knew any one it gave me more delight to condemn. Will your highness pass that to her majesty for signature, and pronounce his sentence?" His highness, with a grin of most exquisite delight, did as directed, and Sir Norman looked steadfastly at the queen as she received it. One of the gauzy nymphs presented it to her, kneeling, and she took it with a look half bored, half impatient, and lightly scrawled her autograph. The long dark lashes did not lift, no change passed over the calm, cold face, as icily placid as a frozen lake in the moonlight. Evidently the life or death of the stranger was less than nothing to her. To him she, too, was as nothing, or nearly so. But yet there was a sharp jarring pain at his heart as he saw that fair hand, that had saved him once, so coolly sign his death warrant now. But there was little time left to watch her, for as she pushed it impatiently away, and relapsed into her former proud listlessness, the dwarf got up with one of his death's head grins, and began. "Sir Norman Kingsley, you have been tried and convicted as a spy, and the paid hireling of the vindictive and narrow-minded Charles, and the sentence of this court, over which I have the honor to preside, is, that you be taken hence immediately to the place of execution, and there lose your head by the axe." "And a mighty small loss it will be," remarked the Duke to himself, in a sort of parenthesis, as the dwarf concluded his pleasant observation by thrusting himself forward across the table, after his rather discomposing fashion, and breaking out into one of his diabolical laughter claps. The queen, who had been sitting passive, and looking as if she were in spirit 1,000 miles away, now started up with sharp suddenness, and favored his highness with one of her fieriest fiery glances. "Will your highness just permit somebody else to have a voice in that matter? How many more trials are to come on tonight?" "Only one," replied the Duke, glancing over a little roll which he held. "Lady Castlemain's, for poisoning the Duchess of Sutherland." "And what is my Lady Castlemain's fate to be?" "The same as our friends here in all probability," nodding easily, not to say playfully, at Sir Norman. and how long will her trial last? Half an hour, or thereabouts. There are some secrets in the matter that have to be investigated, and which will require some time. Then let all the trials be over first, and all the beheadings take place together. We don't choose to take the trouble of travelling to the Black Chamber just to see his head chopped off, and then have the same journey to undergo half an hour after for a similar purpose. Call Lady Castlemaine, and let this prisoner be taken to one of the dungeons, and there remain until the time for execution. Guards, do you hear? Take him away." The dwarf's face grew black as a thundercloud, and he jumped to his feet and confronted the queen with a look so intensely ugly that no other earthly face could have assumed it. But that lady merely met it with one of cold disdain and aversion, and, keeping her dark bright eyes fixed chillingly upon him, waved her white hand in her imperious way to the guards. Those warlike gentlemen knew better than to disobey her most gracious majesty when she happened to be, like Mrs. Joey Gargery, on the rampage, which, if a flashing eye and a certain expression about her handsome mouth spoke the truth, must have been 20 hours out of the 24. As the soldiers approached to lead him away, Sir Norman tried to catch her eye, but in vain, for she kept those brilliant optics most unwinkingly fixed on the dwarf's face. "Call Lady Castlemaine," commanded the duke, as Sir Norman with his guards passed through the doorway leading to the Black Chamber. "Your Highness, I presume, is ready to attend to her case." "Before I attend to hers or anyone else's case," said the dwarf, hopping over the table like an overgrown toad, "I will first see that this guest of ours is properly taken care of, and does not leave us without the ceremony of saying good-bye." With which he seized one of the wax candles, and trotted with rather unprincely haste after Sir Norman and his conductors. The young knight had been led down the same long passage he had walked through before, but instead of entering the chamber of horrors, they passed through the central arch, and found themselves in another long vaulted corridor, dimly lit by the glow of the outer one. It was as cold and dismal a place, Sir Norman thought, as he had ever seen, and it had an odor damp and earthy, and of the grave. It had 2 or 3 great, ponderous doors on either side, fastened with huge iron bolts, and before one of these his conductors paused. Just as they did so, the glimmer of the dwarf's taper pierced the gloom, and the next moment, smiling from ear to ear, he was by their side. "Down with the bars!" he cried. "This is the one for him, the strongest and safest of them all. Now, my dashing courtier, you will see how tenderly your little friend provides for his favorites." If Sir Norman made any reply, it was drowned in the rattle and clank of the massive bars, and is hopelessly lost to posterity. The huge door swung back, but nothing was visible but a sort of black velvet pall, and effluvia much stronger than sweet. Involuntarily he recoiled as one of the guards made a motion for him to enter. "Shove him in! Shove him in!" shrieked the dwarf, who was getting so excited with glee that he was dancing about in a sort of jig of delight. "In with him! In with him! If he won't go peaceably, kick him in head foremost." "I would strongly advise them not to try it," said Sir Norman as he stepped into the blackness, "if they have any regard for their health. It does not make much difference, after all, my little friend, whether I spend the next half hour in the inky blackness of this place, or the blood-red grandeur of your royal court. My little friend, until we meet again, permit me to say au revoir." The dwarf laughed in his pleasant way, and pushed a candle cautiously inside the door. "Good-bye for a little while, my dear young sir, and while the headsman is sharpening his axe, I'll leave you to think about your little friend. Lest you should lack amusement, I leave you a light to contemplate your apartment; and for fear you may get lonesome, these two gentlemen will stand outside your door with their swords drawn till I come back. Good-bye, my dear young sir, good-bye." The dungeon door swung to with a tremendous bang. Sir Norman was barred in his prison to await his doom, and the dwarf was skipping along the passage with sprightliness, laughing as he went. End of chapter 12.